The key concept in understanding psychosis in the top-down paradigm is information, or also complexity, both of which kind of come down to the same thing. If we are understanding psychosis the other way around, from a bottom-up perspective, then we don't need to worry about complexity. In fact, if we're studying anything in a bottom-up way, complexity never comes into it, simply because complexity isn't acknowledged. Just to reiterate, a bottom-up approach means that we can understand everything that happens on the basis of the basic ingredients. And that means that there isn't any complexity. So we could look at complexity in terms of the number of different aspects which something has. So, as is sometimes said, the number of levels of description that are needed in order to try to describe it. And the more qualitatively different ways they are of looking at something, the more complex that thing is. If something is susceptible to being described exhaustively from just the one perspective, it's not a complex thing. It doesn't have other aspects which can only be seen when we walk around the block a bit and look at it from a different way. So, one good thing about using the top-down paradigm for looking at psychosis is that it stops us being cocky or arrogant or assuming we already know what's going on when we don't. And that makes us more respectful to people who are experiencing psychosis. Because experiencing psychosis doesn't just mean that your brain has gone wrong and you're spouting nonsense. It means, from the top-down perspective, that you have encountered something too big to describe using normal language, and too big to understand using our normal thought processes or our normal categories. So if we become incoherent or use strange language, that's not surprising. Anyone who has an experience like that, an experience that's bigger than everyday life, which could be, say, as an example, it could be someone that's had a spontaneous mystical vision. They come out of it not talking the same language as everyone else, but that's no reason to disrespect them. Just because they've encountered a bigger chunk of reality doesn't mean that we should feel superior to them, even if that experience has caused them a lot of confusion and distress. So coming back to the idea of complexity, when it comes down to it, everything is complex. The universe itself is incredibly complex. It's not just incredibly complex, it's endlessly complex. So in mathematics they say the most complex object is the Mandelbrot set, simply because if you started trying to describe it, you'd never get to the end of it. And so your describing of the Mandelbrot set will be every bit as complex as the Mandelbrot set itself. So you wouldn't be saying anything new. So why bother trying to describe it. You're not adding anything to it. And that's reminiscent of something that Robert Anton Wilson said. And he said, the only thing equal to the universe is the universe. In other words, any descriptions that we might have of the universe are by their very nature drastic oversimplifications. We've left out a hell of a lot of stuff, in other words. If we didn't, we would never be able to move on. So if I was trying to describe some object within the universe, which necessarily has exactly the same complexity content as the universe as a whole or any other part, which is the holographic principle that everything contains everything. But if I try to refer to something, it will take me the rest of my lifetime to try and explain it, so I develop a very quick conventional way of talking about it and say, can you pass me the thing, whatever it is. I don't need to go into the infinite complexity of the thing. And you know what I mean, and so you just hand it to me without without the need for that. But then the problem with that is that we descend into a subjective reality that is made up of conventional descriptions or conventions, and we start to feel kind of confident in not a good way, more of a cocky, unfounded way, because we think we understand everything, and that makes us feel too sure of ourselves. It's unfounded. It's a false sense of security because we've forgotten. So that's the result of this type of amnesia thing. We've forgotten that our so convenient conventions are only just little ways we have of talking about things, and that they in no way do they partake in the actual essence of what we're talking about. And so then we move straight into a world that is made up of nothing but mental constructs or logical descriptions, which is removed from reality itself. It doesn't, knowing that world doesn't tell us anything about reality itself. And actually, far from telling us something about reality, it puts us on the wrong footing. It sends us off down the wrong road, because we then think the more we know about our conventional symbols and signs for reality, the more we know. And so we're actually entering into a dimension of delusion. And this is what Jean Baudrillard calls hyperreal or hyperreality. Hyperreality has this nature that, because it's so easy to talk about and to understand, it fills all the available space and becomes everything, and drives out the more subtle and difficult things which can't stand up to it. So in a way, it's like the bully of the obvious. If something's obvious, we can't stand up to it, even if what is obvious, so-called obvious, isn't true at all, but a mere convention, a mere way of looking at things that's run away with itself and become a reality all on its own. So hyperreality is a virulent and aggressive type of thing which quickly fills all the available space and drives out the far subtler, nuanced world that is indescribable, and that is what we are actually describing in the first place. It drives it completely out. So the crude drives out the subtle. And then we end up living in this cheap and nasty, this tacky world that is made out of crude, obvious meanings. And that actually is the world that we do live in. So we just need to take a look around ourselves. It's a very cheap version of reality, because the mind always produces cheap versions of reality. because there are no nuances in rational thought. It's this or it's that. There's no nuances there at all. There's nothing further to it, really. It's brusque, and it has no time for anything which can't be seen in this dismissive, brusque way of it, which gets rid of reality for a start. So we adapt to this mind-created world. We adapt very well, and any time anything comes up that doesn't abide by the rules that the mind itself has created, gets laughed at as being stupid or fanciful or airy-fairy or hippy-dippy or whatever, simply because it is more nuanced and subtle and complex than the crude reality which we have now become subsumed in helplessly. So that clearly doesn't sound like a great thing, in the sense that we're missing out, really. We're missing out on an awful lot for the sake of nothing, really, because living in hyper-reality doesn't actually serve us in any way. So we're living in this world, but that isn't to say that reality can't burst through to us, possibly in a very powerful way. And when it does, because we are so habituated to a non-complex world, a world that is reassuringly rational, in where everything is understood and can be explained, when something that is more multidimensional, so to speak, breaks through, it's a very scary and disempowering, because the way we have of dealing with the world no longer works with it doesn't work with the real world. It only works in our private pretend toy universe that we all agree on and that we think is the real world. So actually we've made reality into our enemy. So when it comes on the scene, we have to fight against it in some way, which we may be able to do. We may be successful in the short term. It could be said that pretty obviously we're all pretty successful in fighting against reality. So we should take credit for that. Take a bow, accept a few accolades. We've been pretty successful. And the evidence, very simply, for that is, of course, that we never see reality. We know nothing of it. It's a complete stranger. So we must have been successful in fighting against it. Instead of a world that is made up of strange stuff, we live in a world that is made of normal stuff. So we've won the war, for the time being at least. But this does really put us in a bad position, because we're no longer able for reality. We're not developing a way, in everyday life, we're not developing a way of relating to reality. And that makes sense as something that we should be doing. Like, what are we going to do in this life? And obviously, there's kind of survival type stuff we have to do. We have to eat and take care of all the needs that Maslow talks about on the lower levels of the pyramid. Not that anyone really believes in Maslow's pyramid anymore, but they used to when I was at college. And it does have a certain sort of utility. So we do that. We adapt to the pragmatic necessities. But once we have done that, that seems to be all we're interested in, really. It crowds out everything else, and we're not interested, or it doesn't occur to us to work away at establishing a relationship with reality. And of course, if you say that to anybody, they're going to very probably laugh in your face, because as far as they're concerned, they've established a very good relationship with reality. Thank you very much. And that's why they're walking around so cocksure, because they're under the impression that by becoming familiar with their own concepts, the concepts that constitute their conceptual world that the conceptual mind has created, that they deserve a medal. Even though it does sound like I'm being unfair, but just to make the point that our confidence is entirely unfounded, and it doesn't do us any good being confident in this particular way, by which I mean the way that when you see people in general, there's a kind of smugness almost, not in everybody, but whenever we take the social gain to be all that matters, and the second ingredient, that's the first ingredient, that we're actually very good at the social gain, then we get kind of smug in some kind of a way. You can kind of feel it. It's kind of like the aristocracy. This may not be so true these days, but it used to be. In England, I'd say, I don't know, going back a while, maybe 100 years or so. If you're born in the aristocracy, you were sure of yourself that you had already achieved something, all that needs to be achieved, even though you hadn't actually done anything or done any work. And we're kind of like that because we're kings and queens of our own conceptual universe, and nothing shall challenge us particularly seriously there. So, looking at it like this, what we can say is that when a reality that is more complex than the one that we are adapted to comes onto the scene, we struggle to make sense of it. And the way we make sense of stuff is by comparing the incoming data with our means of interpreting data, our categories, our theories of the world, our models. And when the incoming data fits a particular concept that we have, we say, yeah, I know what's going on here. This is a this or that's a that. But that just can't happen when we're dealing with a complex reality, because no matter what theory we come up with, because there's so much information in a complex reality, it overwhelms all of our rational approaches. So every single theory that we have, it might go some way to explaining it, but then there's ways in which it doesn't. So we need a better theory, a more complicated, elaborate, involved theory. So we carry on stretching our theories to explain what's happening, and ending up with some pretty bizarre theories. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to explain what's happening, because we're so used to thinking we have to explain everything, because we are very challenged if we can't. So when we are suffering from psychosis, it often happens that we have theories that are out of kilter with what are normally considered normal or proper or respectable theories. We have our own pretty far out theories. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a handle on something which actually doesn't have a handle. And because we're not able, because we haven't had the put in the practice that it needs, or matured that part of ourselves that can observe or relate to something without having to understand it at the same time. And that's a thing that can, even if we do see that as a good thing and try the best as best as we can, That's the thing that happens very slowly, that capacity to observe without having to categorize or understand or judge, and realize that it's okay for things to be what they are, even if I can't say what they are. So even if we all started off at an early age addressing that and acknowledging, both as a culture and individually, that this is a good thing to do, to develop our ability to relate to reality as it actually is, rather than as we say it is. Even if we were doing this, it would still be very, very hard if reality showed too much of itself at any one go. So just to say, this is a really big challenge, a really difficult thing. And yet our culture doesn't place any value on that at all. It has absolutely no interest in reality, by which I mean the reality beyond the reality of what we say reality is, which is our ideas and thoughts and collective beliefs. We're interested in that, even though it's as boring as hell, really, and it's not true anyway, and not at all interested in what lies beyond, or interested in the fact that there is a beyond, or there might be a beyond. So we've gotten rid of the beyond. So essentially, we're in this position where our concepts and constructs are being overwhelmed. They're being overwhelmed. But it's not because what we're seeing is a delusion or a hallucination. It's true, our thought process might be, probably will be, stretched into some pretty bizarre forms, and our theories will probably be quite odd, or very odd. But this isn't because we're relating to hallucinations or relating to an unreal thing. It's because we're relating to a real thing. Not that we're relating to, but we're doing the best that we can. And so, from that point of view, a person who is experiencing psychosis is deserving of more respect than we, in this particular culture, tend to give them. They're trying to relate to reality after all, which is more than we are doing. Thanks for watching.